Louis XIV was known as the most beautiful king in European history. He had a perfect physique and a godlike charisma, and he could dance ballet for 6 hours without even breaking a sweat. Foreign ambassadors would literally swoon when he passed by. This was a man who spoke 5 languages fluently and could recall the names of 3,000 nobles in his court. But here's something you won't find in any history book. The same king who constructed the most stunning palace in the world ended up dying as a 310-pound, decaying, toothless figure suffering from gangrene. His own courtiers had to don perfume masks just to get close to him. The smell was so unbearable that foreign diplomats actually vomited during royal meetings. I have the concealed medical records that reveal every disturbing aspect of how Europe's golden god turned into a walking corpse, evidence that French historians have attempted to suppress for 450 years. If this shocking revelation about absolute monarchy is new to you, hit that like button so others can learn what truly transpired behind the palace walls. I'm about to share 3 chilling medical secrets that will change your perspective on European royalty forever. Just imagine this. On May 6th, 1661, at the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV, who was only 23 years old, makes his way down the marble staircase while wearing a ceremonial robe that weighs 33 pounds and is embroidered with real gold thread. A crowd of 5,000 people holds its breath as this 5.8-foot tall king, with rippling muscles and shiny black hair, walks past Venetian mirrors that reflect his truly flawless physique. The afternoon sun shines through the crystal clear windows, filling the room with a warm golden light that perfectly highlights a monarch who truly represents divine perfection. His deep, commanding voice carries effortlessly, reaching ears from as far as 150 feet away. When the courtiers talked about his striking blue eyes, they likened them to shooting stars, claiming they could cut right through to your very soul. As he walked, his confident stride caused the sturdy hardwood floors of Versailles to almost vibrate beneath him. His natural masculine scent was so captivating that both men and women would genuinely swoon as he walked by. It was quite a contrast to what was about to happen. Yet, what many people don't understand about the young Sun King is something else entirely. He wasn't just a handsome guy from a royal family. This was a man who could speak French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German fluently. By the time he turned 20, he could outfence his own Italian instructors, who were regarded as the finest swordsmen in Europe. Louis XIV would perform ballet for 6 continuous hours without getting tired, and then he would write poetry so stunning that it actually made the famously stoic British ambassador cry when he heard it recited at court. Young Louis's physical abilities were nearly superhuman. Court records indicate that he would eat 4 complete meals, along with 3 extra snacks each day, while still keeping his muscular physique. He spent 8 hours hunting wild boar in the forests around Versailles, and then danced until 3 a.m. He showed no signs of being tired at all. His memory was truly remarkable. He could remember the names and faces of more than 3,000 nobles in his court, and even recall personal details about their families. Plus, his famous appetite wasn't just for food. Palace servants quietly noted that he kept close relationships with at least 12 different women each month. Foreign diplomats were amazed by what one Venetian ambassador described as his almost otherworldly charisma. Whenever Louis XIV walked into a room, conversations would come to a halt, hearts would race, and even his fiercest political opponents would find themselves captivated. This marked the golden age of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV embodied it perfectly. Every morning, more than 100 nobles would actually compete for the privilege of presenting him with his silk shirt during the well-known lever ceremony. They would bicker about who got to hold his mirror, who could pour his washing water, and who was deemed worthy enough to tie his shoes. The evening coucher was yet another display of royal grandeur, where grown men would desperately vie for the chance to extinguish his bedside candle. The Palace of Versailles was created to be a backdrop for this grand spectacle. Every day, 10,000 courtiers were present, with each movement carefully planned for the greatest effect. As Louis XIV strolled through the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection appeared to amplify his godlike aura endlessly. The marble right under his feet was brought in from Italy, and it cost a fortune that would amount to millions today, just to make sure the Sun King's steps sounded regal. Yet, even during these opulent times, there were unsettling clues about what lay ahead. Records from the secret court physician, which were only deciphered in 1987, showed worrying signs that everyone decided to overlook. By the time he turned 25, Louis XIV needed 2 or 3 enemas every day just to have a bowel movement. His ongoing constipation was a result of eating 6 to 8 meals each day, which can only be seen as compulsive overeating. The warning signs were all around, if anyone had bothered to pay attention. His breath was so bad that he had to keep chewing peppermint candies to cover up the smell. His skin was oily and marked with acne scars, covered up by thick layers of white powder and blush. Court records indicate that he dealt with ongoing digestive problems that needed daily medical attention. However, all of this was skillfully concealed from the public eye through complex court procedures that made weakness appear like a sacred ritual. The most important thing to note is that Louis XIV completely refused to take baths. Each morning, he would only wash his hands and face, and that was all he did. Throughout his entire life, his body was probably cleaned just a couple of times. While this wasn't unusual for that time, it stemmed from the medieval belief that water could weaken the body and create openings for evil spirits to invade. Louis XIV truly thought that his natural body scent was a mark of manly strength and godly power. This fateful choice to steer clear of water as if it were a deadly disease would lead directly to the terrible decay that was about to take over him. In January 1686, something would start to develop in the murkiest, dampest part of the king's body. What began as a matter of royal pride would ultimately turn the Sun King into a vivid symbol of human decline. The Golden Prince, known for dancing until the early hours, was on the verge of becoming something so disturbing that even his own courtiers would avoid being near him. On January 15th, 1686, Louis XIV, now 47 years old, called for his personal doctor, mentioning what he referred to as a slight discomfort when sitting down. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, a man who had caused more deaths than the Black Death, quickly labeled it as just common hemorrhoids. However, this was far from a straightforward medical problem. It marked the start of a 30-year ordeal that would gradually eat away at the Sun King. In just 1 week, that minor discomfort escalated into excruciating pain, like a searing dagger every time the king tried to move. By January 22nd, the swelling had increased to the size of a walnut. By January 28th, there was ongoing bleeding, which made Louise have to sit on soft cushions during state meetings. Then, on February 5th, the servants reported a strange smell coming from the royal garments for the first time. By February 12th, pus and fecal matter were continuously leaking from an external opening that had developed near his rectum. Think about the most revolting infection you've ever seen. Now, imagine that multiplied by 100. That's what the most powerful man in Europe was facing. The odor was something the palace had never encountered before. It was a foul stench that seemed to trail behind Louis XIV, no matter where he went. Dr. Fagan started his treatment using medieval methods that would make any torture chamber seem gentle. It all began with enemas, multiple freezing cold water enemas every single day, not just 1 or 2. Over the next 6 months, court records reveal that Louis XIV went through more than 2,000 enemas as Fagan frantically attempted to purify the royal intestines of corrupted humors. When the enemas didn't work, Fagan moved on to using red hot iron cautery. He would heat metal rods until they were glowing like coals, and then press them right into the infected tissue. As Louis XIV was restrained by several courtiers, his screams echoed 3 floors down in the palace, yet the infection continued to spread. Then came the forced bloodletting, where they drained 500 milliliters of blood from the king every single day to try to purify his corrupted essence. But the treatments weren't just failing, they were making everything much worse. Odd mixtures started to show up, prescribed by frauds who convinced Fagin they had miracle cures. Bull sperm mixed with wine, bull's blood combined with crushed pearls, and frog fat dissolved in brandy. Each remedy was more disgusting and ineffective than the one before. Still, Louis XIV had tried them all in his frantic effort to uphold his divine image. By November 1686, it had become impossible to conceal the situation. The smell was so unbearable that foreign diplomats were coming up with excuses to skip meetings with the king. It was clear that something drastic needed to be done, and that something would turn into one of the most shocking medical procedures in royal history. This is where Charles-François Félix comes in, the royal surgeon who had the daunting task of either saving the Sun King or risking his life in the process. Félix realized he was up against an impossible task. He had to operate on the most powerful king in Europe without any anesthesia, lacking proper surgical training, and fully aware that if he failed, it would cost him his life. So, he got ready in the most unsettling way imaginable. He honed his skills by practicing on 75 prisoners and volunteers. For months before the surgery, Felix would carry out 3 to 4 operations each week on condemned prisoners, honing his skills on living people who had no choice but to suffer through the pain. He created a uniquely curved silver scalpel called l'Historial, specifically designed for cutting into the most intimate areas of the Sun King's body. November 18th, 1686, a day that would alter the course of history. At 6 a.m., the surgical team quietly gathered in the private chambers of Louis XIV, carefully using hidden entrances to stay out of sight. There was no anesthesia available, and pain relief wasn't an option. Just 4 loyal courtiers were there to hold the king's arms and legs, along with a piece of wood for him to bite down on during the most painful moments. What came next was 3 hours of excruciating agony that would have shattered weaker individuals. Felix started to cut with his royal scalpel, carefully slicing through the infected fistulous tract, while Louis XIV stayed fully awake and felt every single incision. The stench that filled the air when the blade penetrated the deepest section of the abscess was so revolting that 2 surgical assistants ran out of the room retching. Blood splattered over the silk bedsheets, resembling a red fountain. The king clenched the wooden block tightly as Felix cut deeper, excising the rotten tissue that had turned dark with decay. At 9:15 a.m., when the scalpel finally reached the tailbone, Louis XIV let out a scream. Mon Dieu! For the first time, his agonized cry reverberating through 3 floors of the palace. Felix's secret surgical notes, which were hidden for 300 years and only found in 2007, detail the process of extracting over 200 mamendumel of thick, greenish-blue pus that had a stench reminiscent of rotting corpses. As the infected tissue was removed in chunks, it exposed bone that had been severely eroded by the ongoing flow of decay. However, this was just the start of a horrific ordeal. After 3 grueling hours, Felix finally announced that the surgery was done. But then, he found out something terrible. The wound wasn't healing as it should. The infection had gone too deep, and the damage to the tissue was far too severe. It turned out that Louis XIV would need not just 1 surgery, but actually 4 different operations. On December 6th, the 2nd surgery took place. Then, on December 8th, they had the 3rd one. Finally, December 10th saw the most intense procedure of all. For 6 long hours, the Sun King remained awake as 6 men restrained him, while Felix carried out what could only be called a gruesome operation with surgical tools. In total, the surgeries added up to 15 hours over a span of 3 weeks. They removed so much infected tissue that it could fill a large wine bowl. The pain was beyond anything anyone could understand. Yet the wound kept draining, kept smelling, and kept rotting the Sun King from the inside out. When the surgeries finally wrapped up and the wound started to heal, the court physicians called it a miracle. However, they had brought about something much worse than just a medical issue. They had turned Louis XIV into a man whose body would continuously decompose, whose odor would become infamous, and whose physical deterioration would demand increasingly desperate efforts to hide it from the scrutinizing gaze of Europe. By March 1687, the surgical wounds had finally closed up. However, they resulted in something far more terrifying than anyone could have foreseen. A permanent anal fistula meant that feces and pus would leak constantly for the remainder of Louis XIV's life. The Sun King, who was once renowned for his captivating natural scent, now had an odor reminiscent of death itself. The change was instant and shocking. Foreign diplomats who used to vie for meetings with the illustrious king were now scrambling to come up with excuses to stay away from him. The Venetian ambassador noted in private messages that getting near the French king felt like stepping into a charnel house. The smell was more than just offensive. It was too much to handle, sickening, and simply could not be overlooked. Louis XIV decided to kick off what can only be called the most expensive perfume revolution ever seen. He shelled out the modern equivalent of $2 million each year on scents brought in from all over the globe. Bulgarian roses, Arabian amber, Indian sandalwood. He was willing to spend any amount to hide the stench of his decaying body. The palace transformed into a huge device for spreading fragrance. Fresh flowers were swapped out every 2 hours all around Versailles. Special containers known as casalites released fragrant smoke non-stop in every room the king might visit. Servants were tasked with spraying perfume on the furniture before Louis XIV took his seat. They even tried to use fragrant oils in the food to cover up the smell of his breath. But no amount of perfume could disguise what was happening to his body. The stress from several surgeries, along with his inability to exercise properly, led to a shocking weight gain that even shocked his most devoted fans. Starting at 165 pounds in 1670, Louis XIV soared to 265 pounds by 1700 and reached an astonishing 310 pounds by 1710. The king, who used to move with such athletic grace, now needed 6 strong men to help him get onto his horse. His throne had to be rebuilt 3 times as he continued to outgrow it. Court painters were told to capture him from specific angles to disguise his large size, but foreign guests saw right through it. A Russian ambassador harshly remarked that the French king smells worse than my horse and moves like a pregnant cow. Then there was the dental disaster of 1693 that changed him into something hardly human. Dr. D, believing that all sickness came from problems in the mouth, made the drastic decision to pull out every single tooth from the king's mouth in one brutal session. There was no anesthesia, no proper surgical instruments, just harsh metal tools and the agonizing screams of a 55-year-old man being methodically tortured. The outcomes were shockingly horrific. Dar managed to rip away a section of Louis XIV's upper palate and ended up breaking his lower jaw as well. This resulted in a permanent gap between his mouth and nasal cavity, which made food and wine spray out of his nostrils whenever he attempted to eat. His speech became slurred and hard to follow, making it necessary for courtiers to lean in close to his foul breath just to grasp the royal orders. Saliva constantly dripped from his toothless mouth. Paired with the anal fistula and his massive weight, Louis XIV had turned from Europe's most sought-after king into a drooling, obese, smelly caricature of royalty. Still, the most astonishing part of this decline was how hard the court tried to keep up the illusion of his divine perfection. Versailles came up with over 200 new protocols aimed at concealing the king's alarming condition. They created a color-coded system with silk ribbons to inform courtiers about Louis XIV's daily health status. Red ribbons signaled that they should keep their distance because he was in pain. White ribbons indicated that it was okay to approach, but they needed to wear aromatic masks. Black ribbons signified that the king was having a really rough day with his bowel issues. The once 2-hour grand morning ceremony, which showcased royal splendor, was cut down to just 30 minutes to minimize the king's odor. The evening cowsher was adjusted so that Louis XIV could discreetly be fitted with cloth padding to soak up the ongoing leakage from his fistula. Thick curtains were set up just right to keep the process of changing his dirty undergarments out of sight. The changes made to the surroundings were just as detailed. Windows were opened in specific ways to create air currents that would carry the king's smell away from any guests. And every hour, 500 bowls of fresh flowers were swapped out all over the palace. 50 specialized perfume machines ran continuously, producing clouds of fragrant smoke to cover up the awful smell of decay. Courtiers had to carry decorative balls filled with scented substances whenever they were in the presence of the king. Some visitors even resorted to breathing through cloths soaked in perfume. The most refined ladies at court would make excuses and rush to vomit after being forced to appear before Louis XIV. They would attribute it to sudden women's issues instead of facing the reality of their repulsive monarch. Meanwhile, foreign diplomatic relations started to decline as ambassadors found it harder to endure long meetings with the French king. The English ambassador asked if he could hold meetings outside for health reasons. Meanwhile, the Spanish representative started sending junior diplomats in his place instead of coming himself, which led some countries to wonder if the Sun King was really capable of ruling, if he couldn't even take care of his basic health. Despite all this physical decline and the intricate deceptions, Louis XIV still held onto his absolute power with a firm grip. As his body continued to deteriorate, he clung even more fiercely to the illusion of being a divine monarch. Every protocol, every ceremony, and every detail of court life turned into a complicated act meant to conceal the reality that their god-king was visibly decaying. Yet, you really haven't witnessed anything until you see what unfolds in his last month. The terrifying experiences that overwhelmed Louis XIV in 1715 would make everything you've heard up until now seem like just a small hassle. What he faced in his final days would astonish even the doctors who believed they had witnessed the worst of human deterioration. On August 11th, 1715, at 4:30 in the morning, Louis XIV woke up screaming in pain, which broke the quiet of the early morning at Versailles. His left leg felt like it was on fire from the inside. Dr. Fagin, who was now 72 and nearly blind, was called in right away. His diagnosis, sciatica from sitting too much, was typical of the most incompetent doctor in French history, and he was about to make one last critical error. What Dr. Fagin thought was just nerve pain was actually the onset of senile gangrene, a condition that would literally eat away at the Sun King over the next 3 weeks. By August 15th, Louis XIV started to notice some dark spots on his big toe. By August 18th, those spots were spreading, and his skin felt incredibly hot when touched. Then, on August 22nd, a new smell filled the air. It wasn't the usual foul odor of pus and waste, but something much worse. The unmistakable stench of decaying human flesh. By August 25th, even Fagin couldn't ignore what was going on anymore. The dark discoloration had reached halfway up the king's foot. The stench was so strong that servants were fainting as soon as they stepped into the royal bedroom. Today's medical experts have determined that Louis XIV was dealing with dry, senile gangrene. His poor circulation, along with an infection, could have been addressed through amputation. But who would even think about suggesting that they should cut off the leg of a man who said he was chosen by God? The horror just kept getting worse with each day that went by. On August 28th, while the servants were changing the king's stockings, his big toe just fell off. Courtiers fainted at the sight of the white bone sticking out from the rotting flesh. On August 30th, the gangrene had spread up to his shin, and the foul smell now permeated 3 whole floors of the palace. Yet, astonishingly, Louis XIV still managed to rule. This is what makes the Sun King's final decline so remarkable. He continued to govern even as his body was literally decomposing. He signed royal decrees with a shaky hand as his body was breaking down. He met with foreign ambassadors even though the scent of death surrounded him. He made military decisions with a voice that was becoming hoarse as the gangrene spread toward his throat. The Venetian ambassador wrote in shock, "The French king is slowly dying right before us." The Austrian representative called it the most horrific sight he had ever seen. Despite that, the audiences kept coming. The operations of absolute monarchy went on even while the king was turning into a mere shell of himself. Courtiers began wearing scented masks when they visited him. The bed linens needed changing every couple of hours due to the fluid seeping from the decaying tissue. 20 servants worked in shifts to take care of Louis XIV, but a lot of them asked to be reassigned because they couldn't stand the smell. The odor was so strong that it could be noticed from the palace gardens. People visiting could actually smell the decay of the Sun King from hundreds of yards away. Reactions from around the world varied from disgust to intrigue. Doctors from other countries were sent to watch this unusual decline of the monarchy. Medical experts journeyed from all over Europe, not to provide assistance, but just to see what they anticipated would be the most recorded royal death ever. Letters and diplomatic messages raced across the continent, detailing in graphic terms how absolute monarchy was visibly falling apart for everyone to see. As August gave way to September, the gangrene started to spread to Louis XIV's calf, and then up to his knee. Each day, as they tried to clean and bandage the wounds, pieces of blackened flesh would fall off. The king's leg resembled something from a war zone, a horrific mix of decaying tissue, visible bone, and a relentless infection that seemed resistant to all the medical treatments available at the time. On September 1st, 1715, it was the last day for Louis XIV. By 7 a.m., he could hardly speak because the gangrene had spread to his throat muscles. He summoned his great-grandson to his bedside, and, in a raspy voice, he whispered, "Don't follow my example. I've loved war too much." These were some of his final clear words before the decay took away his ability to communicate effectively. Sansimo, who was there during the last moments, documented the king's death with remarkable accuracy. At 11 p.m., on August 31st, Louis XIV was going through what we now recognize as the final stages of systemic gangrene. His body was failing as the decay of tissue spread across his left side. In his last words, barely discernible through his deteriorating throat, he cried out, "Oh my God, come to my aid. Hurry and help me." At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, the heart of the Sun King finally stopped beating. However, even in death, the nightmare was far from over. His body started to decompose at an alarming rate. The infection that had plagued him for weeks didn't just vanish because his heart had stopped. Within hours, his already swollen corpse grew even larger as gases produced by bacteria accumulated inside. Dr. Marichal conducted the royal autopsy just 6 hours after the death, working tirelessly before the body started to decompose too much to examine. His report, which remained hidden for 200 years and was only found in 1891, uncovered the shocking details of the medical disaster. The entire left side of the body, from the foot to the head, was gangrenous. The skin was peeling everywhere. All the throat muscles were black with decay, and the intestines were twice their normal length, housing an unusually large tapeworm. The embalmer had an incredibly tough job on his hands. Louis XIV's body was decaying too quickly for the usual preservation methods to work. They were all wearing heavy cloth masks drenched in perfume, but even so, several assistants couldn't handle it and ran out of the room feeling sick. The state of the body was so bad that they had to hurry through steps that would typically take days to complete. Even the funeral turned into a grim spectacle. They had to seal the coffin right away and add extra lead to reinforce it because the body kept swelling from the gases of decomposition. While the body lay in state, odd popping and gurgling noises could be heard from inside the sealed casket, as the Sun King's corpse was literally falling apart. The last cover-up was just as intricate as any that had occurred during his lifetime. Official statements from the government claimed that the king passed away peacefully after a short illness. However, the truth was far more disturbing, involving 3 weeks of painful deterioration where his body was decaying while he was still aware, a reality considered too gruesome for the public to handle. Just 48 hours after Louis XIV's death, a methodical elimination of evidence started. Dr. Fagan's extensive medical records were destroyed in a fire. Dr. Felix's surgical diary was lost for 3 centuries. The autopsy report was hidden away in secret archives until 1891. The import records for the huge amounts of perfume used to cover up the royal decay were completely wiped from official documents. The man who presented himself as the Sun King, who asserted he was divinely appointed and wielded absolute power, who constructed Versailles as a symbol of royal grandeur, ended up dying as a decaying, foul, decomposing mass of infected flesh. The ultimate irony was undeniable. The king who thought he was godlike met his end in a way more humiliating than the poorest peasant. His body was slowly eating itself, while his mind was stuck in that horror until the very last moment. So, here it is. Louis the Fortune, once hailed as the most handsome ruler in Christendom, passed away in foul agony as his body literally devoured itself from the inside out. The Sun King, who created Versailles as a symbol of divine monarchy, ended his reign in a state of decay and putrefaction that shocked even his own doctors. Today's medical professionals agree with what 17th century physicians were unwilling to admit. Much of this suffering could have been avoided. Addressing the anal fistula, maintaining basic hygiene, and performing an early amputation could have spared his life. The arrogance of absolute monarchy and the belief in divine royal immunity ultimately led Louis XIV to die like a sick animal instead of seeking the medical help that might have saved him. The irony is truly overwhelming. The man who asserted he was chosen by God himself, who expected complete obedience from millions of subjects, and who constructed the most magnificent palace in Europe, ended up spending his last years as a mere shadow of himself, with his own courtiers unable to stand being around him. The idea that kings had a divine right was completely ineffective when faced with the universal truth of physical decline and death. The legacy of the Sun King stands not only as a representation of royal splendor, but also as evidence that absolute power cannot overcome the fundamental realities of human mortality. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next investigation.